The results arrived on a Thursday morning, in 2 separate envelopes, both addressed to my sister's house, both from the same laboratory, both containing information that would, by the end of that day, permanently alter the landscape of 2 marriages and 1 family's understanding of itself. My sister had called everyone together before the results arrived. This was, I understood later, a deliberate choice. She had wanted an audience for what she anticipated would be a vindication. She had wanted my husband present. She had wanted my mother-in-law present. She had wanted, I think, the specific satisfaction of watching me be exposed in front of the people whose opinion of me mattered most to my life as I'd constructed it. What she had not wanted, had not planned for, had genuinely not considered when she organized this gathering with the confident efficiency of someone who believes the evidence they've commissioned will say what they've decided it will say, was that the laboratory had processed both samples in the kit she'd ordered, and that the second envelope contained information she had never, in any version of the future she had imagined when she paid $149 for a consumer DNA paternity test, anticipated receiving. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. My name is Maya. I have been married to my husband, David, for 6 years, and our son, Oliver, is 18 months old. He has David's jawline and my eyes and a laugh that belongs entirely to himself, and he is, without qualification or complication, the most straightforwardly joyful thing in my life. My sister's name is Priya. She is 3 years older than me, married to a man named Rohan, and the mother of an 8-year-old boy named Aiden. She is also, and I say this with the complicated honesty of someone who has loved a difficult person for her entire adult life, someone who has spent most of our relationship in a state of low-grade competition with me that she has never fully acknowledged and I have never fully been able to ignore. The competition had, over the years, expressed itself in ways that ranged from mildly irritating to genuinely damaging. When I got into the university program she'd been rejected from 2 years earlier, she spent the following months making comments about how that particular program had really gone downhill in its admission standards. When David and I bought our house, she found, within weeks, a house in a better neighborhood that she and Rohan then spent 18 months and considerable financial stress renovating to a standard that she could discuss publicly with obvious satisfaction. When I was promoted at work, she reminded everyone at the family dinner where I shared the news that she had received a similar promotion the previous year, though in a different industry, at a different company, making the comparison entirely meaningless while somehow still managing to deflect attention from my moment. I had learned to navigate these dynamics with the weary patience of someone who has long since stopped expecting them to change and has simply adjusted her relationship with disclosure accordingly, sharing good news with Priya after it was already established, cushioning announcements with context that preemptively absorbed whatever comparative energy she was likely to deploy. When I got pregnant with Oliver, I told Priya after I'd told my parents and after we'd confirmed the pregnancy was past the first trimester and after I had, if I'm honest, sufficiently established my own emotional security about the news that her inevitable complicated reaction would land on something solid rather than something still forming. Her reaction, when I told her, contained all the elements I had learned to anticipate. Genuine warmth wrapped around a subtle current of something less generous, congratulations delivered alongside a slightly too detailed account of her own pregnancy and how much more difficult it had been, comments about how having a second child was a completely different experience from a first and she hoped I was prepared for how demanding it would be. What I had not anticipated, in this pregnancy specifically, was the particular form her competition would eventually take. Priya had met David before I had. This is a fact I am including not because it is dramatically significant on its own but because Priya assigned it a significance that I never understood until the DNA test revealed the architecture of her thinking. They had met at a party, 3 months before David and I met at a friend's wedding, and had spoken briefly, and Priya had subsequently mentioned him to me as someone interesting, in the vague, non-committal way she mentioned things she hadn't fully decided how to feel about. When David and I then met and began a relationship, Priya's response had been, on the surface, entirely supportive. She liked David, she said, he was clearly good for me, she was happy for us. What I didn't know, And what I would eventually understand only in retrospect, was that Priya had continued to think about David in ways that went beyond ordinary sisterly interest in a sibling's relationship, and that this continued thinking had generated, over the years of my marriage, a specific and damaging conviction. She had decided, somewhere in the space between her own genuine feeling and the particular way insecurity can distort the interpretation of observed evidence, that David had chosen me over her, rather than simply having met me at a different party 3 months later and found something real, and that this represented a wrong that hadn't been adequately accounted for in the subsequent 6 years of apparently normal family relationships. I knew none of this when Oliver was born. I knew none of this during the early months of Oliver's life. I knew none of this until my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon, about 4 months after Oliver was born, and told me, with the particular careful tone of someone delivering information they're not certain they should be delivering, that Priya had been asking questions. What kind of questions? I asked. My mother was quiet for a moment. About Oliver. About the timing of things. About whether David was traveling for work around the time you would have conceived. I sat with this for a long moment, processing what my mother was actually telling me, which was that my sister had been doing calculations, the specific, retrograde arithmetic of someone trying to construct a timeline that would support a conclusion they'd already reached. She thinks I cheated, I said. I don't know exactly what she thinks, my mother said carefully. I just thought you should know. I told David that evening. His response was the contained, careful anger of someone who takes an accusation seriously without allowing it to become consuming, and we agreed to wait and see whether Priya's questions remained questions or became something more. They became something more approximately 3 weeks later, when I discovered, through a chain of circumstances that I'll explain in more detail in a moment, that Priya had ordered a consumer DNA paternity test, had obtained a sample from Oliver during a visit to our house under the pretense of a playdate with Aiden, and had sent both samples, Oliver's and David's, which she had obtained by collecting a used cup from our kitchen during the same visit, to a laboratory for analysis. I discovered this because Oliver's pediatrician's office called to ask a routine question about a form I'd submitted, and during the call, the receptionist mentioned that someone had called earlier that week asking about genetic testing requirements, describing themselves as a family member. The description was vague enough to be unclear but specific enough that, combined with my mother's earlier warning, the pieces assembled themselves into a picture I wished I wasn't looking at. I called Priya directly. She denied it, initially, with the specific over-emphatic denial of someone who hasn't prepared their denial carefully enough and is therefore reaching for too much certainty rather than calibrated ambiguity. Then, when I told her what the pediatrician's office had told me, the denial shifted into something closer to justification. She was concerned, she said, she had noticed things, she was just trying to understand. Understand what, specifically? I asked. David is away a lot for work, she said. You've seemed stressed. Oliver has some features that. Priya, I said, and the single word contained everything I needed it to contain about how I felt in that moment. She had already sent the samples. The laboratory had already received them. The results were already being processed. I told David. I told my mother. And then, because the test was already in motion and the results were already coming and there was no practical mechanism for stopping any of it, I made a decision that I think Priya had not anticipated. I called her back. When the results arrive, I said, you're going to open them in front of everyone. Not privately. Not with just me and David. In front of Mom, in front of your husband, in front of whoever else you've shared your suspicions with. If you're going to make this accusation, you're going to make it completely, and the results are going to be received completely. There was a long silence on the line. Fine, Priya said, which told me that she was entirely certain of what the results would show, certain enough that a public revelation of them felt like an opportunity rather than a risk. We gathered at Priya's house on that Thursday morning, David and I arriving with Oliver in his car seat, my mother already there when we pulled up, Rohan in the kitchen making coffee with the specific, slightly too busy energy of a man who knows something significant is happening but has not been fully briefed on the details. The 2 envelopes arrived while we were all assembled in Priya's living room, delivered together, both from the laboratory, both addressed to Priya as the person who had submitted the samples. She picked them up from the front doorstep herself, and when she came back into the living room holding them, her expression carried the specific, barely contained triumph of someone who has been waiting for this moment for weeks and is finally here. She didn't notice, in that moment, that there were 2 envelopes rather than 1. Or perhaps she noticed and assumed they were simply 2 parts of the same result, the way that sometimes test results arrive across multiple pages. She would understand the significance of the second envelope very shortly. She set them on the coffee table, and the room arranged itself around them with the particular gravity of a group of people who all understand that what happens next is significant, though not everyone in the room understands it in the same way or with the same anticipation. "Should we open them?" my mother asked, her voice carrying the careful tone she'd been using since this whole situation began. Priya reached for the envelopes. I watched my husband's face. I watched Rohan's face. I watched my mother's face. And I waited. I need to take you back further than the DNA test, further even than Oliver's birth, because the full picture of what Priya had been constructing in her own mind requires understanding the specific architecture of our relationship across the years that preceded it, and understanding Rohan, and understanding something about Priya's marriage that I had been observing in fragments for years without assembling into a complete picture. Priya and Rohan had married 9 years ago, in a wedding that our family still discussed as one of the most beautiful they'd attended, a 3-day celebration that Priya had planned with the meticulous perfectionism she brought to everything she considered important. Rohan was, by any external measure, an excellent match, successful, good-looking, attentive in the ways that read well at family gatherings, the kind of husband who remembered anniversaries and gave thoughtful gifts and said the right things at the right moments with an ease that suggested genuine feeling rather than calculation. What I had observed, over 9 years of watching their marriage from the particular vantage point of a family member who was present enough to notice things but not so intimate as to have the full picture, was something more complicated than the marriage Priya presented publicly. Rohan traveled for work, extensively and frequently, in ways that had, early in their marriage, seemed like straightforward career demands and had gradually, as the pattern persisted and Aiden grew older and Priya's professional life contracted to accommodate the logistics of primary parenting, come to feel more like a preference than a necessity. I want to be precise about what I mean by this, because I am not interested in characterizing Rohan unfairly based on incomplete information. What I observed was a man who seemed, on the occasions when he was present in family settings, slightly less fully invested in the specific texture of domestic life than might have been expected from someone whose wife was managing it largely alone. Who occasionally had his phone in his hand during conversations in ways that felt like distraction rather than necessity. Who, on 2 separate occasions that I had noted without fully processing, had been vague in ways that seemed slightly elaborate about where he'd been when Priya asked questions about his schedule in front of family. I had attributed these observations, individually, to the ordinary, imperfect texture of a long marriage rather than to anything more specifically concerning. I had not assembled them into a pattern because I had no particular reason to look for a pattern, and because observing potential problems in a sister's marriage when you have no direct knowledge of those problems felt, to me, like the kind of speculation that produces more damage than clarity. But I mention these observations now because they are relevant to something the DNA test would eventually reveal, and because I think understanding what Priya had been living alongside, whether she was fully conscious of it or not, is relevant to understanding why she directed her energy toward me rather than toward what was, it turns out, considerably closer to home. Priya's behavior during my pregnancy had a quality that I had noticed in real time and had interpreted, at the time, as the specific flavor of competitive anxiety that my good news reliably generated in her. She visited frequently during the pregnancy, more frequently than had been her pattern before, and her visits had an attentiveness to detail that occasionally felt slightly uncomfortable, specific questions about my prenatal care, about David's schedule during the pregnancy, about which friends I was spending time with and how often. Questions that, individually, seemed like the natural curiosity of a sister who was interested in her sibling's pregnancy, and that, assembled in retrospect, revealed someone who was conducting a quiet, sustained investigation. She had made one comment, approximately 6 months into my pregnancy, that I had registered at the time as thoughtless but not particularly significant. We were at my parents' house for a Sunday lunch, and David was serving drinks while Priya and I sat together in the garden, and she had looked at him from across the lawn and said, in a tone of apparently idle observation, "He seems like he's in a particularly good mood lately. Has he been different at home?" I had said something noncommittal and moved the conversation elsewhere, because the question felt slightly odd but not odd enough, in isolation, to require direct addressing. But I remembered it, the way you remember things that don't quite fit even when you can't yet articulate why they don't fit, and when my mother told me several months later that Priya had been asking questions about David's work travel during the conception period, the memory of that garden comment arranged itself alongside the new information and began forming a picture I wished wasn't forming. The specific incident that I believe pushed Priya from private suspicion to active investigation happened at Oliver's 4-month birthday gathering, a small family lunch that we'd hosted at our house to mark what David and I had always planned to celebrate as a milestone for getting through the initial, most demanding phase of new parenthood. Priya had been there, with Rohan and Aiden, and the gathering had been pleasant in the ordinary way of family occasions where everyone is behaving well and no one is saying what they're actually thinking. At some point during the afternoon, Aiden had needed help with something in the garden, and David had gone outside with him while Priya and I sat together in the kitchen and Rohan watched Oliver in the living room. Through the kitchen window, I had been able to see David and Aiden in the garden, and David had been doing what David characteristically did with children, fully present, physically engaged, the specific quality of adult attention that children respond to with obvious pleasure. He had been helping Aiden with something involving a ball and a makeshift target he'd constructed against the garden fence, and Aiden had been laughing with the unself-conscious delight of a child who is receiving exactly the kind of attention he most enjoys. I had noticed, out of the corner of my eye, Priya watching this scene with an expression that I had filed at the time as appreciative and had since reinterpreted as something considerably more complicated. She had said, almost to herself, "He's so good with kids." I had agreed, said something warm about David's natural ease with children, moved on. Priya had said nothing more. But something in her expression, in the moment immediately after my response, had shifted in a way I couldn't quite read, and she had looked away from the garden window and back at her tea with the specific, slightly too deliberate quality of someone actively redirecting their attention. I believe, though I cannot know this with certainty, that Priya had observed David's ease with Aiden in that garden and had interpreted it through the lens of what she had already been privately constructing, that his natural affinity with her son was somehow evidence of a connection she had invented rather than simply the ordinary quality of a genuinely good-natured man who was easy with children generally. The DNA kit order, I eventually pieced together, had been placed approximately 2 weeks after that gathering. She had ordered it online, a consumer paternity testing kit that cost $149 and promised results within 5 to 7 business days. The kit required 2 samples, one from the child and one from the potential father, and came with the collection swabs and the prepaid return envelope and the privacy guarantee language that consumer genetic testing companies always include, language designed to reassure customers that the information they're seeking will remain confidential. She had collected Oliver's sample during a visit to our house the following week, the playdate she'd arranged with Aiden as cover. Oliver had been in his bouncer in the living room, and at some point during the visit, while I was in the kitchen making lunch and David was helping Aiden build something in the garden, Priya had apparently used one of the collection swabs on the inside of Oliver's cheek. She had collected David's sample from a glass he'd used during the same visit, the particular method of obtaining a DNA sample without the subject's knowledge that requires a surface the person has recently had contact with, something Priya had apparently researched in advance. I know these details not because Priya told me voluntarily but because, after everything that happened, she eventually told the full story to my mother and to a family therapist they both subsequently saw, and my mother relayed the outline to me in the specific, careful way she relays information she believes I need but finds difficult to deliver. How I discovered the test was in motion was, as I've described, through the pediatrician's office call and the chain of inference that followed. But there was one additional piece of information that I have not yet mentioned, and that I think matters for the full picture. 3 days before the results arrived, Rohan came to our house alone. He told me he wanted to talk privately, which was unusual enough. Rohan and I were cordial but not particularly close, our relationship defined primarily by our shared connection to Priya rather than any independent friendship. He sat in our kitchen and he said, with the particular careful discomfort of someone who has been rehearsing what they want to say for longer than the conversation would suggest, that he knew about the DNA test, that Priya had told him what she'd done and what she was expecting the results to show, and that he wanted me to know, before the results arrived, that he believed me. "You believe me about what, specifically?" I asked, because the sentence felt slightly incomplete. He looked at his hands for a moment. "About David," he said. "About there being nothing. I know Priya has convinced herself of something that isn't true, and I think she's done it because it's easier than looking at things that are actually true. I'm not sure how to explain that without explaining more than I should." I looked at Rohan for a long moment, processing the specific quality of that last sentence, and something assembled itself in my understanding that I hadn't previously allowed to fully form. "Rohan," I said carefully, "is there something I should know? Something that's relevant to why Priya has been looking in the wrong direction?" He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. "The results are going to answer more questions than Priya intended to ask," he said finally. "I think you should be prepared for that." He left without saying anything more, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time after the door closed behind him, understanding, with a clarity that felt simultaneously like knowledge and like the threshold of something I wasn't yet ready to fully cross, that the DNA test Priya had ordered to expose my secret was about to expose something considerably more significant than anything she had imagined when she placed the order. Priya picked up the first envelope. She did it with the particular deliberateness of someone who has been waiting for this moment and wants to inhabit it fully, who wants to feel the weight of it before the contents confirm what she's already decided they'll say. Her hands were steady. Her expression was composed in the specific way of someone performing composure rather than experiencing it. The room was very quiet. David sat beside me on Priya's sofa, his arm pressed lightly against mine, the same contact we'd maintained since arriving, the specific physical language of two people presenting a unified front without needing to discuss doing so. My mother sat in the armchair nearest the window, her hands folded in her lap, her face carrying the careful neutrality of someone who has been trying to remain unaligned throughout a situation that has made alignment increasingly difficult. Rohan stood near the kitchen doorway, slightly apart from the rest of us, and I noticed, without looking directly at him, that he had been standing in that specific position since we'd all assembled in the living room, as though he had calculated the exact distance from the center of the room that would allow him to be present without being fully inside whatever was about to happen. Priya opened the first envelope. She read the result document inside it with the focused attention of someone looking for a specific confirmation, moving quickly past the preliminary language and the laboratory identification numbers and the methodology notes that consumer paternity tests include before the actual result. She found the result. She read it. Something happened in her expression that was very brief and very controlled but that I saw clearly from where I was sitting across the room, a flicker of something that was not quite what she'd expected, a momentary recalibration before she reassembled the composure she'd been performing since we'd all arrived. She looked up from the document and at me, and in that look I understood before she spoke that the first envelope had said what I had always known it would say. "The test confirms," she said, and her voice carried the particular flatness of someone reading a result that has not gone as planned, that David is Oliver's biological father. My mother let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding for longer than she realized. David said nothing, but I felt the slight shift in his posture beside me, the specific relaxation of someone who has been maintaining controlled stillness and is now allowing a small portion of that control to release. I looked at Priya and I said, with a calm I genuinely felt rather than performed, "I know." The room held this moment for approximately 4 seconds, which is long enough, in a charged silence, to feel like considerably more. And then my mother said, "There are 2 envelopes, Priya." Priya looked at the coffee table, where the second envelope was still sitting, and I watched her process this in real time, the recognition that she had been so focused on the first envelope, so certain of its contents and so occupied with managing the disappointment of what it had actually said, that she had not yet given the second envelope its proper attention. "That's probably just the paperwork," she said, reaching for it with the dismissive confidence of someone who has already categorized something as unimportant. "Priya," Rohan said, from the kitchen doorway. Something in his voice made her stop. She looked at him. And I watched the specific thing that happens when a person reads, in the expression of someone they know well, information that rewrites their understanding of a situation they believed they controlled. "What is that?" she asked, and her voice had lost the performed composure entirely, replaced by something rawer and more uncertain. "Open it," Rohan said. His voice was very quiet. It was the voice of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has arrived at the moment when the carrying ends, not because they've chosen to put it down but because the circumstances have made that choice for them. Priya opened the second envelope. I want to describe what happened in the following 30 seconds carefully, because I think the specific sequence of her reading, the physical tells of comprehension arriving in stages, matters for understanding the full weight of what the room witnessed. She read the beginning of the document with the same focused speed she'd applied to the first envelope, looking for the result, moving past the preliminary language. She slowed when she reached the methodology section, which described both samples that had been tested, the child's sample and the potential father sample, and their relationship to each other. She stopped entirely when she reached the result. She read it once. She read it again. She looked up from the document, and for a moment she looked at no one specifically, her gaze going somewhere slightly above the level of the room, the specific unfocused quality of someone whose brain is processing something that their eyes are not currently needed for. Then she looked at Rohan. "This says," she said, and her voice was barely recognizable as her voice, "that Aiden's, this says." "I know what it says," Rohan said. The room took a moment to understand what was being said, the way rooms sometimes need a beat to process the full implications of something that arrives too suddenly for immediate comprehension. My mother understood first. I watched it cross her face, the specific, sequential recognition of what the second envelope had been testing, what result it had returned, and what that result meant about Priya's marriage and Priya's son and the 8 years that had elapsed since Aiden was born. David understood a moment later. His arm, which had been pressing lightly against mine, went very still. Priya was still looking at Rohan. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since Aiden was born," Rohan said. "I had a test done privately. I've known for 8 years." The specific devastation of that sentence, 8 years, landed in the room with a weight that I think everyone present felt simultaneously, the particular gravity of a long deception finally disclosed not through choice but through the accidental, entirely self-generated consequences of someone else's investigation. Priya had ordered a DNA test to expose my secret. The test she ordered had tested 2 samples, Oliver and David, whose relationship the first envelope confirmed. But the laboratory, processing the second sample she had submitted, David's sample, from the glass she'd collected at our house, had cross-referenced it against Aiden's sample in the same batch, as part of the standard familial relationship analysis that consumer paternity tests include when multiple related samples are submitted together. The result had not been what she was testing for. It had been something else entirely, a familial relationship question she had not intended to ask, answered definitively by the same laboratory that had answered her intended question. Aiden was not Rohan's biological son. 8 years, Priya said, and her voice had entirely vacated the register of someone in control of a situation they've planned carefully. She was somewhere else now, somewhere much more fundamental and much more frightened. "You've known for 8 years and you stayed." "I stayed for Aiden," Rohan said. "I stayed because whatever happened before he was born, he is my son in every way that matters. But I also stayed knowing this would eventually surface in some form, and I was not going to be the one who surfaced it." The room had fractured, in the way that rooms fracture when information arrives that reorganizes every relationship within them simultaneously. My mother had pressed both hands to her face. David was beside me, but his attention was entirely elsewhere, processing a scene that had nothing to do with us and everything to do with the family we'd been pulled into the center of. I was watching Priya. I want to be honest about what I felt watching my sister in that moment, because the honest account is more complicated than any simple version would be. I had spent weeks, months, really, if I counted from my mother's first warning, in the position of someone who has been accused of something she didn't do by someone she loves, and the specific injury of that position doesn't simply dissolve when the accuser is revealed to have been carrying their own concealed wrongdoing. It coexists with other feelings. It sits beside them without canceling them. I felt the particular, exhausted relief of vindication, the release of something I'd been holding since the Sunday afternoon when my mother had first called me and described Priya's questions. I felt the grief of watching my sister collapse inward in front of our entire family, because whatever she had done, she was still my sister, and watching her face in that moment was genuinely painful in ways that had nothing to do with whether she deserved the pain. And I felt something else, something quieter and more uncomfortable, which was a recognition that the second envelope's revelation had not come from nowhere, that the 8 years of Rohan's private knowledge and private grief had a history that preceded the DNA test, a history that Priya had been living inside without fully understanding it, and that this history was, in some complicated way I couldn't entirely trace, connected to the particular direction her paranoia had taken. Priya turned, eventually, from Rohan to me. And in her expression I saw something I had not expected to see, and that I have thought about many times since that Thursday morning, not anger, not the defensive calculation I might have anticipated, but something much more unguarded and much more difficult to watch. She looked ashamed. Not of being caught, I think. Or not only of that. She looked ashamed in the deeper, more fundamental way of someone who has just understood, at the moment of their own exposure, the full weight of what they had been attempting to do to someone else. Maya, she said. I looked at her. I'm sorry, she said. It was, I thought, the first fully uncalculated thing she had said in the entire course of this situation. My mother stood up, which seemed to break something in the room's suspended quality, and she went to Priya, not because Priya deserved comfort in that moment more than I did, but because my mother is the kind of person who moves toward people in pain regardless of what produced the pain, a quality I have spent my entire life alternately finding beautiful and slightly exhausting. Rohan had not moved from the kitchen doorway. He was looking at no one in particular now, his expression carrying the specific quality of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something to happen and has found, in the moment of its finally happening, that it feels nothing like they imagined it would. I looked at David. He looked at me. And in the specific, accumulated shorthand of 6 years of marriage, we communicated, without words, that we were ready to leave. We left Oliver with my mother, who indicated with a look that she would manage what remained, and we walked out of Priya's house into the ordinary Thursday morning outside, where nothing had changed and everything had, and we sat in the car for a long moment before either of us said anything. Are you okay? David asked. I thought about this question honestly before answering. I don't know yet, I said. Ask me in a few days. He started the car. The days following that Thursday morning had a quality I find difficult to describe accurately, a strange suspension between the relief of vindication and the grief of understanding the full scope of what had happened to our family, not just in the past few weeks but in the longer, slower accumulation of years that had produced that living room scene. Rohan left Priya's house 3 days after the results were opened. He went to his brother's house initially, then to a rented apartment, the particular geography of a marriage in the process of deciding whether it can survive what has been revealed. He took very little with him, which I understood, through my mother's careful updates, as less an indication of his intentions regarding the marriage and more a reflection of the specific kind of shock that makes practical decisions difficult for longer than you'd expect. Aiden stayed with Priya, which was the right decision for every reason that mattered in the immediate term, and Rohan continued to see him throughout the separation in ways that, by all accounts, communicated clearly and consistently to an 8-year-old boy that whatever was happening between the adults in his life had nothing to do with how much his father loved him. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened with Priya's marriage, because I have only partial information and because the story of two people's marriage belongs primarily to those two people rather than to anyone observing from outside it. What I know, through my mother and through the limited conversations Priya and I had in the months following, is the broad outline. Rohan and Priya spent approximately 4 months in the suspended territory of a marriage that has been formally separated but not yet legally dissolved, a period during which they attended couples counseling, during which Priya had individual therapy for the first time in her life, during which the full story of what had happened before Aiden's birth, who the biological father was, what the circumstances were, what Priya had known and when she had known it, gradually came to light in the contained, facilitated way that therapy makes possible. I don't know all of this story. I know the parts Priya chose to tell me, much later, in a conversation I'll describe in a moment, and the parts my mother knew, and the parts that were simply inferable from the sequence of events. What I know is that the situation was more complicated than any single characterization would capture, that Priya had not been engaging in a sustained, deliberate deception exactly, that the circumstances of Aiden's conception involved a period in her relationship with Rohan that had been, by her own description, genuinely uncertain, and that what had followed had been a series of decisions made by two people trying to build something from an imperfect starting point, rather than a straightforward story of betrayal. Rohan had known since Aiden was born. He had made his own decision to stay, for his own reasons, and had lived with that decision for 8 years with a privacy that I found, when I fully understood it, both remarkable and slightly heartbreaking. Whether the marriage survived this full revelation, whether two people who had been navigating around this truth for 8 years could find a way to navigate through it, directly and openly, with the assistance of therapy and the passage of time, is not something I have a definitive answer to, because the last update I received, approximately 7 months after that Thursday morning, was that they were still in the process of deciding. What I can tell you is that Aiden appears, from everything I observe at family gatherings and from what my mother tells me, to be a child who is loved consistently and completely by both of his parents, regardless of the status of the marriage between those parents, and that this has remained true throughout every stage of what the adults around him have been working through. This, I think, is the thing that matters most among the many things that matter. My relationship with Priya has changed in ways I am still, honestly, in the process of understanding. In the immediate aftermath of that Thursday morning, we had no contact for approximately 6 weeks, a silence that felt, from my side, necessary rather than punitive. I needed time to process what had happened without the complexity of ongoing interaction, and I believe Priya needed the same thing for different reasons. My mother served as the careful, patient intermediary she had always been in our family's more difficult periods, conveying basic information in both directions without pressuring either of us toward a reconciliation neither of us was ready for. The first conversation Priya and I had after the 6 weeks silence was a phone call she initiated, and it was, I think, the most honest conversation we had ever had in our entire shared history as sisters. She didn't attempt to explain or justify the DNA test. She didn't offer me the kind of contextual framing that makes an apology feel like a negotiation. She said, in language that was simple and direct in a way I'd rarely heard from her, that she had done something wrong, that she had done it from a place of fear and insecurity that she was only beginning to understand through therapy, and that the wrong she had done was not something she could correct but was something she intended to spend time genuinely accounting for, not through grand gestures but through the slower, less visible work of actually changing how she related to me. I want to be honest about how I received this apology, because the honest version is not as clean as a story like this might invite. I believed her. I believed the sincerity of what she was saying in that phone call, and I believed that the therapy she had begun was producing genuine reflection rather than performed contrition. I also believed, and said so directly, that believing her didn't immediately translate into returning to whatever version of sisterly closeness we had maintained before, because what she had done had not been simply an impulsive mistake but a sustained, deliberate investigation built on an accusation she had been constructing in her own mind for months, and that the repair of trust, if it happened at all, would be slow and would need to demonstrate itself over time rather than being declared. And then assumed. I understand that, she said. I need you to also understand something specific, I said. Whatever was happening in your own marriage, whatever you were managing or avoiding or afraid of, none of that made me a reasonable place to put it. I was not the explanation for what you were afraid to look at directly. And Oliver was not a reasonable instrument for investigating it. I know, she said, and her voice carried the particular weight of someone who has arrived at a real understanding rather than a rehearsed one. We have spoken approximately monthly since that first phone call. The conversations are shorter than our conversations used to be, more careful, less assumed in the way that conversations between people with a long shared history are usually assumed. We have seen each other at family gatherings, where we have been cordial and occasionally genuinely warm in moments that surprised both of us, I think, with their naturalness. I do not know what our relationship will eventually look like, whether it will recover something approaching its previous closeness or whether it will remain in this careful, reduced form indefinitely. I have stopped trying to predict it, which feels like its own kind of progress. David and I have talked about that Thursday morning more times than I can count, in the specific way that couples process something that happened to them together, returning to it from different angles, finding new dimensions in it, using it as reference point for conversations about trust and family and what it means to know someone and to be known by them. He told me, about 2 months after the results, that the 3 weeks between my mother's initial warning and the Thursday morning had been the hardest of our marriage so far, not because he had doubted me but because he had experienced, from the inside, what it felt like to have his character questioned by people whose opinion mattered to his life, and that this experience had produced in him a specific empathy for situations he had previously understood only abstractly. I think I've always intellectually understood that being accused of something you didn't do is deeply unfair, he said. I don't think I understood viscerally what that unfairness feels like until I was inside it. Now you know, I said. Now I know, he agreed. Oliver, who is now nearly 2 years old and has no knowledge of any of this and will not for many years, continues to be the most straightforwardly joyful thing in my life. He has David's jawline and my eyes and a laugh that belongs to no one but himself, and the specific, absolute certainty that he is loved by everyone around him, which is, I think, the best possible outcome of a situation that produced considerable damage in other directions. I think about Priya's motivations often, because I think they're more complicated than the obvious reading would suggest, and I think complexity matters when you're trying to understand something rather than simply to assign blame. She had been living, for 8 years, alongside a marriage that contained a truth neither she nor Rohan had fully processed or resolved. Whether she was consciously aware of the specific truth that Rohan knew, whether she knew, in some part of herself, the full dimensions of what had happened before Aidan's birth, is something I cannot know from the outside and something she herself has described, to my mother, as genuinely uncertain, the specific uncertainty of someone trying to honestly assess what they knew versus what they had trained themselves not to examine. What I believe, though I hold this belief loosely, is that her suspicion of me served a function that had less to do with anything she had actually observed in my marriage and more to do with the specific relief of directing attention outward rather than inward, the particular psychological utility of finding a threat in someone else's life rather than continuing to sit with the unexamined complexity in her own. This does not excuse what she did. I want to be clear about that, because I think excusing and understanding are sometimes confused with each other in ways that serve neither honesty nor actual healing. What she did caused real harm to me, to David, to our marriage's peace during a period when Oliver was newly in our lives and our attention and energy should have been entirely focused on that rather than on defending ourselves against an accusation built from nothing. But understanding the architecture of how she arrived at what she did, the specific, painful combination of her own unexamined situation and her lifelong pattern of competitive anxiety and the particular vulnerability that having a secret can create, making you see secrets everywhere, helps me hold my grief about it in a way that leaves room for whatever our relationship might eventually become, rather than hardening into something that forecloses every future possibility. The DNA test Priya ordered cost $149. It answered the question she intended to ask, which was whether Oliver was David's biological son. It also answered a question she had not intended to ask, which turned out to be the more significant one. She had been looking in the wrong direction for a very long time. The test she ordered, in trying to expose something in my marriage, exposed something in her own that had been sitting there, unaddressed, for 8 years. I don't take satisfaction in this, precisely. I take something more complicated, a kind of bleak recognition that the universe sometimes produces ironies that are too precise to feel accidental, and that the most consequential things that happen to us are occasionally the things we set in motion ourselves while looking for something else entirely. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do by someone who had more reason to examine their own situation than yours, I hope this story reminds you that truth is patient. It waits. It allows people to invest in their own narrative until the moment when the evidence they've gathered, designed to confirm what they've decided, turns in their hands and points somewhere else entirely.